So first of all, to kind of frame our thinking today, you might know me from Bozeman Science. I think that's where a lot of people might know me from. So I started doing YouTube like 10 years ago, I think, quite a bit of time ago, maybe more than that. And so I have a channel called Bozeman Science where I really just talk about science. If you were to look at the videos on here and like how old are they? You can see that most of them are like 10, 9, 8 years old. And so they're probably a little long in the tooth or a little bit dated right now. And so the reason why is that I've been working on other things. And so I was a science teacher and I made my videos back in the day just so I could spend more time in class doing science, not talking about science. That was kind of the point of me making the videos, is I could spend more time kind of like being scientists. And so I want to start by sharing my project that I've been working on for the last 8 years. It's called The Wonder of Science, and I didn't name it until, man, maybe like 3 years ago. But basically, during the last 8 years, I've been working with teachers as they implement at schools the next generation science standards. And so I started making so many resources, so I wanted to curate those and aggregate those in one place. When I was trying to come up with a logo for it, I wanted a logo that would really get at the wonder of our kids. So like that light bulb, I'm trying to get at that. Like the most important thing in our class is our wonder of our kids, that we preserve that and foster that over time. And so the light bulb can turn into a W. So that's just wondering. I want kids to wonder before we ever get to the explanation piece. I also think it's really, really important in math and science that before we even get to the explanation piece, that they're modeling what they're thinking. They're putting together a conceptual model, a mathematical model, some kind of a analogic model, but we're putting together a model of what they're thinking. And then finally, we start to gather evidence to construct some kind of an explanation. And so I think the NGSS has made me shift the way I teach more than any other thing in my whole career. And so there's so much goodness there, but it's also somewhat confusing. And so today, what I want to put forward is not just me pimping my website the whole time. It's going to be me talking about the science of wonder. So why is wonder important? Why is it important that we foster that in our kids? One thing that I didn't understand early going into education is that there's a whole group of scientists that are studying the science of science education. So there are a lot of people who are just doing research on how kids learn, brain research on what's effective. And so for me, that's been a huge growth area. This is what I look like, we'll call a lifetime ago. So this is me. This is my wife took it. Oh, I just saw Jen. Hey, Jen, how are you doing? It's so nice to see some friends on here. Oh, sorry about that. Just give me a moment. So for me, 30 years ago, this is what I looked like before my first day of teaching. My wife snapped this photo in a rural school in Montana, which you can imagine that's pretty rural if it's in Montana and it's also rural. And so this is a picture that she took back then. I had no idea what I was doing back then, but it was just like each day kind of surviving that day and moving to the next one. Me growing as a professional really started though when I started looking at the work of Lillian McDermott. She unfortunately passed away this year, but Lillian McDermott, if you're not familiar with her work at University of Washington, it was all around directed inquiry. And so how do we get kids to do inquiry and how do we take a part of that? And for me, it was like a huge paradigm shift in what I was doing in my class. So I super want to acknowledge Lillian. Also, David Hestenes and his work around modeling instruction. If you're really trying to change your class, this is the foundational way you can change it. And this is work out of American Modeling Teachers Association. Helen Quinn is another big acknowledgement I would put forward. So she is a particle physicist, but also led up the next gen science standards. And for me in my own work, she made a huge change in my career. I also want to thank Joe Krajcek, who taught me how to write good assessments. So performance assessments that are not just assessments of content. I want to thank also Katie McNeil, who taught me what claim evidence reasoning is and how I could use it with my students. I want to thank Brian Reiser, who taught me the importance of we should quit calling them units and start calling them storylines and telling a story in our class. I also want to acknowledge John Osborne and Alexis Patterson, who finally taught me the difference between an argument and an explanation. And that took a lot for, at least for me to wrap my head around that. And then Victor Sampson, who really taught me how to do discourse in the science class, getting kids really talking about evidence and having a conversation. And so I think we always have to lay kudos to like the people who lay before us and the research that they're doing. If you're teaching science and you're not using the most current research of how kids learn science, there's an irony in there. And so I think it's really important that everything we're doing is based on best practice and current research. I would really put forward Helen Quinn as like a mentor. The next gen science standards changed my teaching more than anything else in 30 years. And within that period of time, we had the internet. So like it was a really time, it was all about change, but the NGSS have really like switched my brain in what's the correct way to teach. 8 years later, my motto is the following. My motto when you're teaching, if you're teaching math or you're teaching science, the most important thing is that we don't kill the wonder. The wonder of our students is the most important thing in our class. And once it's gone, it's really hard to kind of rekindle that, especially if they've turned away from like an interest in STEM at all. And so before I kind of move forward, I want to define what wonder looks like. So wonder looks like that. Wonder is a face that you make when you don't understand how something works, but you're interested in figuring out how it works. So you turn your head sideways, you put your hand on the chin, and you just think about like, what's going on with this? I think what we tend to do as teachers is when kids make that face, we want to swoop in and explain how it works, or hold their hand, or point them in the direction of a pathway to an explanation. And every time we explain, we kill the wonder just a little bit. Every time we answer their question, we kill their wonder just a little bit. And so over time, I used to have kids in AP who would come to me and they thought my class was just a class where I would give them information. So disseminate a bunch of information that they then had to regurgitate on some assessment at the end. So they don't even understand the role of me to facilitate that wonder over time. And so to give you a sense of that, and let's kind of start learning a little bit together, to give you a sense of that, I was just in Missouri, and when I was in Missouri, I was going for a walk, and we were walking through a park, and there were some deer. I was just out, I'm into birding right now, so I was out, and we saw this deer that's in a forest, and then this young woman comes up to us. She's falfing in this field, and she's also like vaping and falfing, and she comes up to us and she's like, "Oh my gosh, did you see that thing in the forest?" And so I was kind of freaked out, like, I'll go into the forest, but it sounds a little bit terrifying. So my wife and I go into the forest, and we can see this object that's kind of moving in the distance. There's this white, I felt like I was in Harry Potter when they're trying to find, anyway, so like we're trying to find this magical creature, and then it just kind of eludes us and goes away. And then a little bit later, so we're walking through the park a little bit later, and it just comes out and kind of stands next to us. And so there's this beautiful white deer. They call them like a ghost deer. And then there was a whole family of them. And so there's like 3 of them, and there's a little buck in there. And so if you think of yourself as a teacher right now, our tendency is to impress the teachers around us with how much we know about this deer. So what we want to do is explain to the students or explain to people around us, like what's going on with this deer. And so I think when we do that, we're really just like killing the wonder in those kids, and there's no role for them to do inquiry. If you look here, a little bit of research tells us that there are really 2 groups of deer out there. I'm going to call them type 1 and type 2. And I would also encourage you, if you think you know what causes these deer in the chat, just please be quiet for a second, because you're just killing everybody else's wonder if you try to explain to us what's going on with these deer. So imagine you're a student in my living environment class. Like what we would try to do if we're introducing a new phenomena is I would just have the kids start carefully noticing the phenomena. And so if I were to use an NGSS word, we call that a pattern. And so could you take a second in the chat? If you could just take the second in the chat and just tell me, what are some patterns that you're noticing in these deer? Patterns are just things that we see, things that are the same between these types of deer and things that are different. Thank you so much, Andy, for asking people not to kill your wonder. Something about the nose color Jamie's noticing. There's a coloring pattern. Felicia notices that there are large ears, big eyes, large ears. We're seeing pink. We're seeing no coloration on certain parts. So coloration is a pattern that I'm noticing. So for me as a teacher, I have to notice, like you guys are noticing an observational pattern in color. And so that's an example of something that we're noticing. Kate just noticed that the one on the right has a darker nose than the one on the left. And so let's try to do this. What are some, let's do some comparing, class. What are some patterns that are the same between the two deer? Could you jump in the chat for a second? Compare these two things. How are they similar? White hair, white hair. One is in a residential area. Let's try to get like similarities. How are they the same? Ear size, ear shape, 4 legs, thank you. Pink ears, body parts, body structures, they're thin, they have the same shape. Really, really good. Patterns that are the same. What do we call that in living systems? We call that inheritance. Inheritance is how things are the same and how they share those things. Let's switch it a little bit, class. What are some differences between type 1 and type 2? So what are some differences between the two? Differences in fur length, nose color, head size, hair length. So like at this point, when we're looking at the organisms itself, what do we call differences in living things? We call that variation. And so for me, you still don't know what the lesson is about. Like there's still wonder in your brain. Where could I take this lesson from here? It could be a lesson on genetics. It could be a lesson on selection. For me, when I was selecting this as a phenomena, I would choose it for a phenomena on gene expression. And that's kind of where I would go with it. But imagine if I said, today we're going to have a lesson on gene expression. And then I gave you all the science that you're going to learn. And then there's no phenomena. Like, where's your role as a student? All I'm doing is just explaining the science that you need and then giving you a little bit of chance to kind of to explore at the end. And so for me to start tonight, I really want to tell you that inquiry requires a pedagogical shift in the way that we teach. And this was hard for me in the beginning, but it's like second nature in the way that I teach. Old school, we used to start with explaining the science and then eventually exploring. So it would always be, this is the science that you're going to learn. And then we would do some little lab at the end that in that lab that we're exploring a little bit of the science that I've already explained to you. And so for me, the biggest shift in the NGSS is we explore first. We always explore first before we ever explain. And if you look in the standards, it's never us explaining, it's the students constructing the explanations and the students construct what's going on. For some of you, it's driving you nuts, like what are the deer and what's causing those different type of deer? And that phenomena is hard to kind of like move forward with. I could just kill the wonder for a second. The deer that I saw in Missouri is albino. Albino means you're missing an enzyme to make melanin in melanocytes in the cell. Like now you've got one answer, but it doesn't really give you meaning on the deer itself. Or if we look at the other deer from Seneca, they're leucastic deer. And so they lack the melanocytes themselves. So like it would have been boring if I started with the cellular bit and then we kind of moved to the phenomena. And so one thing I think that we have to always remember is just give kids time to explore. Give them 5 minutes, give them 5 or 10 minutes to explore with the phenomena before we ever dig into the explanation piece. It's the easiest thing you can start do when you're trying to shift what we're doing. New York has a set of science standards called the NISLS. I hope you're familiar with those. They are the next gen science standards. Whenever your state tried to improve them, they generally, but they made them worse anytime they tried to improve on the NGSS. So they are essentially the same thing, and they have these 3 dimensions in it. For me, when it comes to teaching science, there are 3 dimensions in your standards, and you should treat them equally in your class. You should spend about 1/3 of the time in each of those dimensions in your class. Old school way of teaching science, we just loaded the content. That's kind of where we went from. And so for us today, in your NISLS or your New York Science Learning Standards, there's the orange, there's the blue, and there's the green. The orange is what we're going to teach. The blue is how we're going to teach it. And then the green is going to be how we're going to think about it. And so there are these 3 dimensions of what are we going to teach? How are we going to learn? And then how are we going to think as we go through the phenomena? You should know every one of these, and you should know like what are the lessons that I can give kids so they can be successful at argumentation, or what's the mini lesson that I can do so kids can be successful at identifying patterns of similarity and differences in a phenomena. So you as a professional, these are your bread and butter. What's the content we're teaching? What are the practices that we're doing? And then finally, what are the cross-cutting concepts that we're using? For your head right now, that's overwhelming. For me, that was overwhelming when I was starting with NGSS. How do I have a model like this that I could refer to day after day after day, and I could just sketch it out on the wall if I needed that? And so the big thing that I want to share with you today is a model that I've created. So this is a 3D learning cycle model. This is what I always, if I'm ever teaching, I put it up on the wall before I teach any kind of a lesson. And I keep referring to it over and over and over again. If you could watch patterns, let's just look at that change for just a second. Watch where there's areas go in my model. So if we look at where the content is, this is everything that we're teaching. That should always be taught through a phenomena. Whatever we teach, everything we teach should be taught through some kind of a phenomena. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So every day, if I were to go into your class, there should be some phenomena that the kids are trying to figure out. If somebody came into the Zoom a few minutes ago, they would have said, oh, we're trying to figure out what these deer are doing. That would have been the phenomena we're trying to figure out. If we look at the other dimensions, the other two dimensions, the practices I've organized into a hierarchy. So we have these four, we would call this in education like bends. Bend 1 is asking questions. Bend 2 is constructing explanations, generally through models. Bend 3 is investigating, and bend 4 is doing argumentation. So if you want to ironclad, like I'm just getting started with phenomena and I really want to explicitly use the practices, I always start here. Phenomena, questions, constructing explanations. Like this is like a 3-step dance that I always do. Start with the phenomena. What are the questions that the students have and what are their initial explanations? Lots of times this literally takes like 5 minutes to do. After we've got all the explanations out, then you can pull from those explanations to do some explaining of yourself, or better yet, it's better if you just like test those. That's kind of what scientists do. If we look at the cross-cutting concepts, there's a hierarchy is there as well. So there are really only 3 cross-cutting concepts: patterns, cause and effect, and then systems. And then everything else kind of sits within that. If you look on these cards, I also put teacher language at the top. So these are the things that you say. So when we were looking at the deer, I was saying, what's happening in the deer? What do you notice? How are they alike and how are they different? And so those are going to be kind of at the top, or the teacher language piece. Or what do you think, students? Or how could we investigate, students? So these are just kind of like my guide when I'm teaching. My big, and I'm almost done like wrapping the little quick intro before we get to the learning. For me, I wish somebody would have showed me this model like 8 years ago. Like I wish somebody would have explained NGSS in a way to me that was like, that would have made sense. Like this makes sense to me right now. And so like, are you really teaching this way? The question I think you always have to ask yourself is pretty simple. Number 1, every day, is there some kind of a phenomena that I'm using in my class to teach the science that I'm teaching? I love the work of Dan Meyer around math. It's a similar thing when it comes to math. Every day, there's some problem, some real world problem that I'm trying to solve. So we always begin with a phenomena. What is a phenomena? It's just something that occurs in the real world. That's all it is. Something that happens in the real world. What's not a phenomena? A simulation from PhET. A gizmo is not a phenomena. Clip art's not a phenomena. It has to be a real thing in the real world. So you should always be teaching the phenomena to understand the science. But my big takeaway that I want to share with you tonight is the kids will never learn the other dimensions on themselves. They'll never learn how to do proper reasoning in an argument. They'll never learn how to develop a model or find patterns. You have to explicitly teach those other dimensions, and you have to do it through tiny little mini lessons, like 5-minute mini lessons to teach them a skill that they can then apply into the phenomena itself. This is something I've learned over the last 2 years from watching really good elementary teachers. Like they understand what a mini lesson is and how to target a specific skill. And so as we look at this, I want to just kind of dig into the cycle of inquiry, and we're going to do some learning together. Are you with me, class? Going to get a thumbs up, class, if we're going to learn a little bit together. Awesome. So it'd be great if you could, again, like find the chat. I'm going to stop sharing that. Susan Price, can you see these little blocks here? Do these show up for you, Susan? Can you see these here? Does that show up? No. So let me share my screen again. What about now, Susan Price? Did these little blocks show up for you? Okay, perfect. Awesome. So what we're going to do is go through a quick little cycle of inquiry, and I'm just going to use these cards with you together. And so it'd be great if you could kind of find me in the chat. And I might have a couple of you. Uzma, can I borrow you for a second? Do you mind?
Sure thing.
Awesome. Perfect. So you can see the little orange block and the little green block?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you ever seen these before or not?
I've seen your cards. I haven't seen the orange block and the green block.
Okay. Elena, are you with us? Elena, could you unmute for just a second? Yeah. Can you see the blocks here, Elena?
Yep.
All right. So, and you've never seen those before? Okay. Okay, cool. Awesome. So if we're going to engage into a quick phenomena, I would always tell the students, if you know the answer to the phenomena, don't ruin it for everybody else. So that's why I was kind of checking with Uzma and Elena at the beginning. So if we start with this, I've got these two blocks. There's an orange block and there's a green block. So there's an orange block here and a green block. And Uzma and Elena, these are the only ones in the world because I made them in my garage, and they're the only ones that exist in the world. So like, we're going to have to figure out exactly how these work together. Uzma, like if we start with this, so we'll start with this, the green block stands up like that. So it stands up properly. But if we look at the orange block, if we look at the orange block like this, the orange block will fall over. So the orange block is unstable. Does that make sense, Uzma?
Yep.
And then it can also be stable though. So like if I talk to it, it'll be stable. So it's in a stable position. So if we start with Uzma and Elena, what are some questions you might have about the phenomena?
I'd want to know what the blocks are made out of and if
Gotcha.
their masses are different.
Perfect. Awesome. So if we think about this, let me kind of just explicitly make what you just did like viewable. So in the phenomena, am I getting this right? You've got a question. Is that right, Uzma? Like you're curious about something? And what I heard you being curious about is you're really interested in the structure of the blocks, what they're made up of. Am I getting that right, Uzma?
Yes.
Like you're interested in what they're made up of. But I also heard you say this, like you are curious about the phenomena, but you're not so worried in the second part about the structure. You're more interested in the quantity. You wanted to know about the mass between the two blocks. Am I getting that right?
Yep.
Awesome.
Correct.
So Elena, what do you have for a question? What is a question you might have?
I'm wondering if the bottoms of the blocks are shaped differently.
Gotcha. So on the bottom, if there's some kind of a shape on the bottom that makes one more stable than the other, is that what you're saying? I love it. Yeah. Now, Elena, what I'm saying is like, can you hear me just saying, I really like your question, but not answering the question? Does that make sense? So like, I'm validating that you asked a question, but I'm not going to answer the question. Like, what do I say as a teacher? That's a really, really good question. If we go to the chat, could you give me some questions, class? What are some questions you might have, like Uzma and Elena? Is the mass evenly distributed in both? I like that one, Michael. What else do we have, chat?
Annie wants to know, is the whiteboard connected to a device? Are there any magnets below the table? Is the table magnetic? Are the dimensions of each block the same?
Awesome.
There's a lot of predictions happening that there might be a magnetic component. Gotcha. Are the blocks hollow? Some more structure questions. The environment that the block is in. Is the whiteboard flat?
It's a good question.
Are you handling them in a specific way, the blocks? Do you place them the same each time?
I like it. So for me, with a phenomena like this, I always start with what do we notice? And then what are the questions that we have? Kids always want to tell you how it works. And what I would always tell them is, we'll get there. The way you think it works, just phrase that in a question, which all of you guys did as good teachers. You said like, is there a magnet in the board, or you're doing something to it? So I think you're asking questions that kind of get at the explanation or constructing an explanation. For me, the things that we always do when we're teaching this way is we start with the phenomena. The first thing that I always do is ask questions. So I want you to ask questions about the phenomena, and I want to share that with the whole class. The reason we're sharing questions with the whole class is that we're better understanding the phenomena itself. Let me give you formative feedback, class, on your questions. There are 3 parts of a good scientific question, and almost all of your questions are only satisfying 2 of those parts of a good scientific question. So there are 3 parts of a good scientific question. Let me kind of go through those. They're also on the back of these cards. So there's a rubric on the back of the cards. So like a good scientific question, number 1, addresses the phenomena. All of yours did. If you ask something like, can you make a video for my class, Mr. Bozeman Science? That's a question, but it's not a good scientific question. So like number one, it has to address the phenomena. Number two, it has to be testable or empirically testable. And so I think we're all doing good on that. But then the last thing of a good question is you have to specify the nature of the question. What kind of a question are you asking? And we could classify questions into one of these three categories. So there are three broad types of questions you can ask. You can ask cause and effect questions. That would be, is there a magnet in your whiteboard? How could you improve your question? If you're asking a question like that, you should use the word cause in your question. Is there a magnet in the whiteboard that's causing one to remain stable or one to kind of be unstable over time? And so the big advice I would give you all is we need to be more explicit in our questions. And by being explicit in our questions, we'll tell people how more we're thinking. So example, could you give me a question related to this phenomena that has both the word cause and effect in it, class? So you could throw that in the chat if you would. Give me a question in the chat that has both the word cause and effect in it. And I'll just play with the blocks for just a little bit. Uzma, it was really nice when you were like reading some of those questions. That was good teamwork. So we're looking for a question that explicitly has the word cause and effect in it.
What is causing the orange block to fall easily?
Gotcha.
Is there a difference in shape of the white board at various places that causes the block to fall at one point?
Perfect.
Does the board cause one to fall more easily?
Perfect.
Did you sand an edge of the orange block to cause the block to fall?
It's a really good question. So that now we're starting to ask questions that are explicit science questions. I could ask, I don't think anybody's asked a question that has the word energy in it. I don't think anybody asked a question that had the word energy in it. So class, could anybody give me a question that has the word energy in it? What's a question that has energy in it? Is there a magnetic field that's causing the orange to fall? Or it could be this, if I improve your question, Felicia, just a second. So is there a magnetic field that's provide energy to either hold the orange brick in a solid position or in a more unstable position? So like, I hope you feel this in your brain. Us just starting to think about energy allows us to think more broadly about the phenomena itself. So if I keep going, where would we go? This is how I always teach science is also, did you feel that little mini lesson there on how to ask good questions? It really was short. It was like 5 minutes, but hopefully you carry that with you forever. There are 3 parts of a good question. You address the phenomena, it's empirically testable, and then you specify the nature of the question, especially with one of these cross-cutting concepts. Next thing we would do is we would construct explanations. So let me try that in here, class. Could you, in the chat, could you give me a cause? Why do some of you think that the green one is stable, but the orange one can either be stable or unstable? What is the cause? Could you give me a cause, class, in the chat? Mass of the green block is closer to the bottom. Really, really good question, Alan, or wondering. One is lighter than the other. Alan Zollner, are you with us? Alan, are you here? Could you unmute for a second, Alan? Are you with us, Alan? We've lost Alan. How are you handling it? Does the green block have a lower?
I am here. I'm sorry. It took me a while.
Alan, it's okay. What should we do? You're thinking there's a lower center of mass in the green one. Is that what you're saying, Alan?
Yeah, so it's more stable because it's at a lower energy level.
What should I do, Alan? I got these, we got to figure these out. Like, what would you have me do? Give me an experiment.
I might suggest that you try to balance the green one and the orange one sideways on your finger to see if, you know, if the mass is closer to one side or the other.
Really good, Alan. Alan, it's like balancing here with the green. Like this is where it's balancing.
And then
right around there. And then we'll go with the orange. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more up here. Gotcha. Or I got this, Alan. I don't know if you can see this, but I got some water here. So we could just throw them in and we could figure out like, what do they do in the water? Are you picking up on that, Alan?
Yes, I am.
Gotcha. So like, what are we doing now? Are you with me? Like, this is an investigation. We just did a quick investigation. Alan, what kind of an argument could you construct now? Help me out on a claim with evidence and reasoning.
Well, I would claim that the green block has its mass distributed closer to the square side than the rectangular side.
Perfect. What
And-
evidence are you using, Alan? Like where it's sitting in the water? Is that what you're using?
Well, both it's sitting on the water and the way it fell off your finger where you found the balance point.
I like it. Help me on reasoning. Could you give me some reasoning to your claim and evidence?
Well, the side, the heavier side is going to have a greater force pulling it down.
I like it.
And so that's what we saw on your finger here. It's showing that the narrow side of the green one is denser than
like
the orange one.
Perfect. We could also, Uzma, like get the mass of it, right? Uzma, we want to see which one's heavier. Which one are you thinking is heavier than, Uzma?
Maybe the orange one. Is the orange one the one that kept falling?
Yeah, that's the one that keeps falling, yeah.
But now, based on many of the other comments and questions and observations, I'm not sure that it's a mass difference.
Green's like 57 grams, so we figure out what the orange is. Like, it's almost identical. Orange is 58 grams. So very, very
Okay, so
similar.
no mass difference. Lots of
Yeah.
new predictions. People want to know about the density.
Gotcha. I've got magnets too. We can see if there's magnets in it. Are you with me, class? So like, where did you get a sense of where they're thinking the magnets are?
People seem to think that the orange block maybe has a magnet, I think in the bottom. Folks
Gotcha.
Tell me like that part of the bottom, one side of the bottom,
Right.
or that the weight is not distributed evenly.
So like, this would be good evidence, right? A compass, people, is that right? We could do a compass on the bottom and see what happens with the compass. So when I move the compass, let's see if I move the compass around it. Let's see, I'm shaking a little bit.
Nothing's
Okay.
happening.
Nothing's happening, Alan, right? We could also say, like, is that really a compass or is he tricking us again? So we could use a magnet. I've got a magnet here and we could see the magnet really moves the compass. So we could say there's maybe no magnet in it. Are they made of the same material or different things? Is there a ball bearing inside one that moves? Hey, Kristen Ritter, are you with us, Kristen? I love your model, what you're thinking. Could you
Yes,
unmute,
I'm
Kristen?
here.
Yeah, tell us what you're thinking. It sounds cool. What do you think?
Like when you tipped your hand, maybe the ball bearing moved to the top of the L and caused it to fall forward, or moved to the back and made it more stable.
Gotcha. So like, is there, if I just sketch out a quick model of what you're saying to me? So you're
Yeah.
saying, let me help with this. So if this is the orange one, is that, can you see that, Kristen?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's like hollow or has like a tube hole in the inside.
Is it here in the bottom part or the top part? Where is it? Help us
I
on your
think it goes the
model.
whole way through, kind of like a straw.
Gotcha. So there's a straw in here. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it also goes over the hook.
Oh, and it goes here.
And you could make a ball like get stuck in the front or fall down into the back.
Gotcha. All right. That's a really cool, Kristen, you're a genius. This is awesome. So if I were to make this live, you are constructing an explanation. It's what you think, and we've drawn a model here. So Kristen, how do we test it? How do we figure out if you're right or wrong? What do we do?
We could saw it in half.
No way. This took me forever, Kristen, to make. This is like one of my COVID passion projects. We're not going to saw it in half. So help me out, Kristen. Or
Yeah,
class, how could shake it? Thank you, Alan. Like shake it, right? Let's shake
Totally.
it. I'm hearing something, but it's real quiet, Kristen. Like when I shake it this way, it's real quiet. When I shake it this way, there's nothing, Kristen. So there's nothing in this direction, but there's a slight shaking when I move it in that direction.
Maybe
know,
it
Chris-
just, does it roll across just the top then and not down the side?
Is that what you're saying? Can you hear Kristen like reworking her model a little bit? Is this what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Gotcha. How could we test that, Kristen?
I don't know.
Come on, class. Don't like Kristen's like so close. Figure it out. What do we do? sand in the top, find the density, Carla. We could try this. We could just try to like tap it down. Are you with me? Like we could tap it down, Kristen, and make sure that thing goes down and then maybe put it up and then it falls over. We could maybe tap it in the other direction like this. We could see what that does. And it maybe stands up. So that's another investigation that we could make. So the key thing, I hope you're picking up on this as a teacher, is that this would be really hard to teach this way if I didn't have a thing in my hand. Also, the moment I tell you what it is, then you don't care anymore. But the moment I keep you rolling, then you're kind of in, trying to figure out exactly how this works. If I would have started the whole lesson, Kristen, nice work, by telling you that there's a titanium plug in here that shifts back and forth to change the weight, then you wouldn't care about it. But like the fact that I'm starting with this and then kind of stepping you through the process of the standards, hopefully you get a sense more of like, what are these 3 dimensions kind of as we roll. What do I think you need for mini lessons at this point? I think you need mini lessons, probably a lot of you, like a mini lesson on claim evidence reasoning. Some of you might need a mini lesson on like how to do a good controlled experiment. So like, what is the answer? The green one has a little titanium plug in it that kind of shifts back and forth. And this one has a titanium plug that's in the bottom, is really what I'm trying to get at with this. But are you with me? It's not the point. The point isn't about the orange block. This orange block can eventually become an ecosystem that has something wrong with it. So it's stable or unstable. This can eventually become a gene. This can become like a chemical process that can have 2 different forms. The key thing I'm trying to teach you with is trying to teach you that the phenomena always sits at the center of our learning and what we're doing. So I'm going to quickly bring this around, and Uzma, I know we're going to go to questions and answers, but can I show one more thing, Uzma? Do I have a couple more minutes to kind of?
Yeah, we have time before Q&A.
Awesome. So I'm going to be in New York. I'm flying to New York on Saturday. I'm going to a school and I'm going to teach a chemistry lesson on Monday. So I have to teach it's a chemistry lesson. They're just starting on periodicity. And so the teacher gave me the standard. And so let me just give you, I haven't really showed this to anybody, but let me show you what I'm thinking for the lesson. So to give you a sense of what the lesson might look like. Sorry, it's going to take me a second to share screen. I'm almost there. Right now, I'm just making weird noises with my mouth to distract you from the fact that I can't find the right document. Okay, perfect. So let's go here. Does that show up, Uzma? Can you see the little fire there? There's like a burning. So this is how I'm going to launch the lesson. So the lesson's going to start with this. I might have to share it with a little bit of sound. Sorry about that. This is a Zoom thing. Perfect. So I'm going to start the lesson like this. We're going to watch this. I can show you like 30 videos like this where firemen are going in to put out a car fire and then you get this big pop. It's also crazy how he just doesn't even flinch and just kind of keeps out putting out the fire. It's pretty wild. But the idea at this point is like, I want kids noticing, I want kids asking questions, I want kids constructing explanations about what they think is going on. If I start the lesson by saying, class, today we're going to learn about periodicity and how metals and the way they react with oxygen are really important in their valence electrons and what they are. And then I were to use this as a demo that really talks about the importance of valence electrons, you don't care as a learner. All I want to do is start with the phenomena and have kids wondering, asking questions, constructing explanations. And then we can start doing experiments. We can start doing explaining later of the importance of, like, when you're putting out a fire, if there's magnesium in there, understanding that it will rip the oxygen away from the water and makes explosive hydrogen and oxygen. But all I'm doing is just tipping it. Like, start with the exploration first and then kind of move to the explanation. My goal with the Wonder of Science is to give you a bunch of phenomena, graphic organizers, mini lessons, kind of support you on the path that I'm on as well. So like for me, the last 8 years have been wrapping my head around what this is, making cards, making videos, so that you can kind of start doing something similar. I always stand on the shoulders of giants for sure. And also like teachers I've worked with in New York State have been so helpful in me kind of wrapping my head around that. I wanted to say, sorry to keep talking. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. Thanks for letting me like be your teacher for a little bit. It always feels weird to be a student. So thanks for kind of digging in. Thanks especially to Alan, Crystal, Elena, and Ida. Uzma, did we want to go to some questions? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul, Mr. Anderson. It's hard for me to call you Paul because I've known you as Mr. Anderson for so long. I think many of us have. Like always, or for first timers, if you're joining us from some other part of the state, we welcome all of our New York State Master Teachers this evening. We will take questions. If you can use the hand raise feature that is in Zoom, we'll start with that. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat as well. We'll try to monitor those and bounce back and forth between them. But let's start with anyone who would like to share a question verbally. Marna, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. First of all, I went to Bozeman this summer just so I could take a picture outside of the high school.
Why didn't you swing by?
But I'm wondering, where do you go for inspiration on phenomena? Because that, I think, for me is the hardest part, like just trying to figure out like where, like ideas.
Can I start with just like my progression, Marna, on that? As for me as a learner and as a teacher, like how my understanding of phenomena has changed. Maybe I'll start there.
Okay.
I think early, I heard the word phenomena and I was like, they got to be phenomenal. Like that's how I was thinking early when this whole idea came out. And so I was like, let me find them all on YouTube or find really cool demos or things like that. And what I really eventually found, Marna, is that that's maybe interesting to you. But if it's just a YouTube video that gets kids excited, there's no way we can like throw the blocks in the water like we were doing with Alan, or like put it on a scale like I did for Uzma. So like there's no way you can finish the cycle by gathering investigations, getting evidence. And so like the biggest thing, Marna, in my own like growth has been the definition for a phenomena is simply any observable event in the real world. So like if we start at that as a beginning, what can a phenomena be? A phenomena can be the demos that we used to do when we taught physics. It can be a data set on like, I don't know, an invasive mussel in upstate New York. It can be just a quick experiment. Like, don't overthink it. The best ones are the ones that are literally like just things that we've used forever and just putting the spin on it. So example, let me give you an actual example, Marna. So like I was doing a lesson where we were just looking at electrolysis. So you run electricity through water and you get hydrogen and oxygen. And I'm like, this is gonna fail. The kids are gonna hate it. But it's because I knew the answer. So I didn't think that they would engage into it. So like just not telling them how it worked and letting them wonder and think about it, like they totally engage into it. So two things, Marna, sorry, it took me a second to get to your question. Number one, don't forget all the things that we've done forever. Like the demos that we've always used, use those, but just don't tell them how it works first. Give them time to wonder. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, Marna, that we always want to fight is like, we don't want the kids just Googling the answer to every phenomena that we have. A lot of them think that that's just how science is. I just look up the answer on the internet. That's not science. That's just research. So I try to find things, Marna, that are just right outside my house. So like, here's a leaf that has this weird thing on it, or that white deer that I took a photograph, or things like that. You'll never find phenomena in a classroom because that's not the real world. So just get out and like, I think you were telling me today, Uzma, it's really windy. Are you getting, is that what you're saying? New York is like really windy this time? And it's abnormally windy. That's your phenomena. Like give the kids time to just ask some questions and wonder about this. When I've started digging into wind patterns, you always get big wind patterns before you get changes in temperature. Like it's a pattern that you start to notice. And so it wouldn't surprise me if you get some like temperature changes or seasonal changes. The kids don't know that though, but just ask like, what questions do you have? What causes the wind? Things like that, I guess. Sorry, that took a while. Uzma.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Marna.
Let's go to a question in the chat, and it kind of relates to Marna's question around how do you find phenomena and how do you make it interesting and so on and so forth. So Shannon Gilroy asked, what do you do when your students are not inspired by the phenomena that you're inspired and excited about?
Yeah, I think it's always test it on some kids first before you go all in with 5 periods of this phenomena. Like, I always use my wife as a way to see if this is going to be like interesting. So just take some people that you know and just like show them the phenomena. And if they're like, oh, that's interesting, why, I wonder why that is, then it's a good one. So always beta test it on other people before you try it in your class. Another thing that I would say is try it on some other kids. I was at a school in London and we were planning a whole unit and it was just a chemistry unit. And we were trying to figure out what we're going to anchor the whole thing on. And our options were like, are we going to do it on like fireworks and the history of atoms? Or are we going to do it on climate change? And how could we use that as a way? So we had these 3 ideas and then we just brought kids out of the hallway and they're all like, all we care about is climate change. Like, it's the only thing that it's our one issue. And we were all interested in taking it in a different way. So like, if we hadn't talked to them about like our understanding of periodicity and how we could use that to, who knows, make like hydrogen fuels or things like, that's what they want to know, is how can we make the world better? So I think that's another way to think, like talk to kids and see what they're interested in. One more thing to build on that, like that's really important if you're going to hang a whole unit or a storyline on a phenomena. Think about that for a long time. If I'm going to have a whole unit or storyline on a phenomena, don't just decide that overnight. Talk to other people and also try to make it relevant to the kids' lives and local. Like that's what we should always aspire to do. But for the ones that just are day-to-day stuff, it doesn't matter. We're trying to teach them those skills. Last thing, make sure that your phenomena is tied to a specific standard you have to address. If it's not tied to a standard, you're about to waste time. Like, and inquiry will waste time. And so we want to make sure that we're not wasting time, that we're inquiring into something that the kids need to know. They need to learn that. Yeah, Ozma.
Great, thanks, Paul. Anyone else would like to ask a verbal question before we return to questions in the chat? There are lots of great questions in the chat, but we want to give you the opportunity to ask Paul directly. Munib Hussein, go ahead, Munib, and you can unmute yourself.
Hi. So my question was specifically on assessments. Like, what way would you assess them at the end of the story? What means do you have besides just like a test? Like, how would we go about it?
Right. Yeah. So like my question back would always be like, what practice is in the standards? So can I give you an example of that, Munib? So it's like, if the standard says students will design a solution to an environmental problem, test it and modify it, I'm not going to assess that with a test. That should be an authentic performance task that we're doing. So they're designing something, we're testing it, or Munib, like, let's say it's about planning an investigation and carrying it out. Don't do that as a like assessment at the end, which is just a test. The kids literally have to plan an investigation. They have to control for a variable. Like they have to do all of that. So like, don't think that an assessment has to be a test. I used to think that as well. I did in my teaching, in my early teaching. Like, so number one, it depends on what the assessment practice is. Know that it'll always be a performance assessment. So it has to be an assessment of the kids doing a thing. So for me, don't think about science, but think about like music or sports when we're really thinking about a performance. At the end, they have to perform they've practiced something. Let's say if I'm in choir, I'm practicing along the way, but there has to be some kind of, at the end, a performance. And so same thing with this. Those standards, the kids should have an authentic audience and should be performing one of these practices at the end. Now, as a resource that Munib, I think that will help you is my long-term goal has been to write sacrificial first drafts for performance assessments for every one of the standards. And so I've written performance assessments for all the elementary standards. I'm 60% of the way through middle school, and I'm about 40% through the high school. So like you can go to the Wonder of Science, you can click on a standard, and there's a 50% chance that I've already written one that you could take a look at. And then just look at that as to, oh, okay, I see how Paul did that. Maybe I would want to use this as a way to make it more authentic in my class. So my goal is eventually to have like performance assessments for all of these, but I'm not quite there yet. It's going to be years to do that. But like, I think this is the key thing. We can all work together to make this really, really cool. But it's really hard if you're all trying to do it in your own classrooms. just by yourself. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up, like, so we're using Amplify, and at the end of the unit, like whatever the anchor final question is, I feel like I keep asking them to tell me the story. So like our first unit is, why is the Mesosaurus fossil separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean? And then they go through this process of getting there, and at the end I'm like, okay, so tell me the story how it got there. But I feel like I keep on using essays each time, so I'll take a look and see, you know, what variety you use, just to get away from that.
Can I answer to that, like, for just a quick second? Number one, science shouldn't be something that we're just reading about or we're gathering information from. They literally should be doing the experiments. So they should be doing hands-on experiments to test their models, which makes it really hard sometimes to do things like a Mesosaurus or something like that. We want to find things that are more close to home. It'd be cool if we could find, I don't know how Manhattan's made, but I would imagine you could find fossils in the surrounding area that we could use to say, man, the climate used to be somewhat different. So that's one thing, try to find local. Another thing I would say, this is advice I think for everybody, the difference between an explanation and an argument. An explanation is what we think. And so what we think happened to the Mesosaur and it got there, there's probably one right answer to it. And in the unit, they're probably all figuring it out really early in the unit. So like, that's not a great one to use for argumentation with claims and evidence and reasoning. Having the kids model what they're thinking in an explanation might be better. If we really want them looking at authentic evidence so they can make a claim with evidence and reasoning, the answer should always be unclear. So never have kids write a CER where there is a clear right answer. Always choose a question where there could be 3 or 4 right answers, because it's not about the kids learning the quote unquote right answer to this one phenomena. It's them learning how to gather evidence to support a claim, to look at another student's claim and say, like, I don't think that evidence supports your claim. That helped me, Munib, of like, am I trying to get the kids to argue with evidence, or are they just constructing an explanation? And if they're constructing an explanation, do what I did with Kristen. I just had her tell me what you're thinking, draw a picture of it. And then, do you remember my question to Kristen was, okay, how are we going to test it to see if you're right? And that, I think, is where you make kids kind of sit up and say like, ooh, I don't know. This is just what I think. I didn't know I had to plan an investigation. Whereas if it's like, we really don't know what the answer is, let's get a bunch of evidence. I hope that's helpful, Munib. Like, really the practice to circle back tells you what to do, I think, is the key thing.
Thanks, Munib. So the chat is popping with lots of questions about assessment, but Hai-Jin, I hope I said your name right, has had her hand up for a while. So Hai-Jin, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I also just go by Jenny, but that works. I actually want to bring you back to the phenomena question. And I really am interested in the idea of units as storylines. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you brought up demos being possible phenomena. Do you differentiate between, like, how would I say, like a storyline establishing phenomena versus the mini lesson content-wise phenomena? So there's like a main phenomenon and like little phenomena. That's like that main one.
Yeah, Jenny. Like, so what's something that you might be teaching in the next months?
So I'm teaching. I'm physics. I'm like a bio teacher turned physics teacher. Imposter syndrome. It's fine. But we're going into kinematics. And so, you know, there's a lot of applications for it. A lot of it, previous years, I've made it about driving, that as like the major phenomena. But then I've also brought in things of like, well, how do you know if something's going constant velocity? How do you know if something is accelerating? So I think, you know, as teachers, we think so topic by topic. We become obsessed with Monday, I'm covering vectors versus scalar. Tuesday, I'm covering what speed is. And then I think we don't think about what links all of that together. So Can
I jump in, Jenny? I love it. Yeah. So like, I'm just going to use yours as an example. So like, for me, number one, kinematics is one where some physics teachers will, my wife's sitting here, she knows I'm going to go off on kinematics. Certain physics teachers will spend 2 months on kinematics and never get to energy and information technology and things like that. The reason we teach kinematics is we used to be in a Cold War and we wanted kids to calculate trajectories on nuclear weapons we were sending to Russia. So the new standards don't have a bunch on kinematics. They simply have Newton's second law analyzing patterns in motion, and then trying to figure out, is Newton's law kind of at play, which is what you were talking about, Jenny. I'm not saying that you would do that, but if you and I are co-planning that unit, I would say, don't start with science, let's start with engineering. So I would say at the beginning of this unit, there are really good sensors in a smartphone, accelerometers. So what we're going to do at the end of this unit class is we're going to design a iPhone or a smartphone like protective case, so that we could drop this and we can reduce the amount of force on the phone itself. We're going to do that in like 6 weeks. But what we're doing along the way is we're using other phenomena of car accidents. We're using phenomena of like motion sensors. We're using like constant velocity cars. We're doing even ticker tape or something. Are you with me, Jenny? But like every time we're like, okay, what did we learn about constant velocity that will be important when we design our sensors at the end? And also I would say, like, if you're teaching physics, adding the rigor and real data from an accelerometer that will drive this unit, real data, messy three-dimensional accelerometer data. So I think to kind of play off what you're saying for everybody, Jenny, when we're planning what is this overall thing in physical science, I always go with engineering. We're going to make something at the end. If it's earth science, we're going to protect people at the end. How can we learn about the world so that we can protect whatever, people during a huge amount of rain, maybe in New York City? If we're doing life science, then we're going to let some big, how are we impacting natural world around us? Like that's going to be driving what we're doing. And then if it's chemistry, like how can we use our understanding of material science to design something at the end as well? So like engineering, I think will drive a lot of that. But for me to use quick jargon, the anchoring phenomena that we're going to stick with the whole time, that's the thing I'm going to keep tying everything back to. The supporting phenomena are the day-to-day things that we use. But then, Jenny, the mini lessons, what I found is that mini lessons should be taught with some kind of a concrete representation. So that orange block, these gears, when you're teaching them mini lessons, don't use a scientific phenomena that's complex. Use a very simple phenomena so that you can teach them those cross-cutting concepts and practices. So to play off that again, on our website, we have some mini lessons around the cross-cutting concepts. I think I have 20 of them that I've put up. With each of those, I have some concrete object that you or the students could use in those lessons. Thanks, Jenny, for your question. Good luck with the unit too. Let's save those phones.
Susan Price, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question that you'd like to ask?
I kind of had it answered in some way, but I was sort of wondering, have you ever had the students come in with their own phenomenon that they're curious about? And have you ever had a situation where they come in with something that like we just don't know, we don't know the answer to that phenomenon, and then what do you do then?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'm always wary about is like, I know how much research went into what content, practice, and cross-cutting concept can kids handle at grade 6 or 3 or 11. Like developmentally, are they ready for a specific practice at this time? So Susan, that being said, I think our job as a professional, at least until we get this whole standards figured out in this three-dimensional teaching, I don't think in a typical science class, I would give them a huge amount of latitude on what those phenomena are, because they might not appropriate to the standard that we're at or the level at which we want to dig into, or I might not even have the equipment to answer the question. I'm not saying that shouldn't be a part of my class. I'm just wary about like, how can I really teach what I'm supposed to teach if I'm giving them control over the phenomena? It's almost like giving them control over the content I'm going to teach when I give them control of the phenomena. Does that make sense, Susan? That being said, that's what we want them to do with life. So in life, as they leave, we want them to see any phenomena out there, and then they have a set of tools or competencies so that they can answer that phenomena. So I think a little bit of that choice, Susan, would be really helpful in classes. Just like figuring out where that boundary is, I think, because a lot of them want to answer stuff that they're not developmentally ready to even understand.
We're going to go to James and then Brian. Go ahead, James.
Hi, Paul. I just wanted to get back and ask you quickly about your phenomena. I am a chemistry teacher, and I love the phenomena with the car exploding when they started putting it out. A big question I had is how would the next step of doing inquiry with them, how would you manage it being safe? Because like periodicity and things exploding and stuff, while it's very cool, I'm not ready to like, put some sodium in the hand of my kids or be like, hey, here's some magnesium, play around
Yeah.
with this. So how would you envision going about that safely? And that's what I'm
I
curious
love it,
about.
James. Is it all right if I show you what I was thinking for the lesson? Maybe
Sure.
I didn't quite finish it out. So let me show you what I'm thinking. Because you're right. Like in chemistry, I always had this like stress where I was always like, no one can ever get hurt. I don't know if that resonates, James, at all. But so does this show up for you? Can you see these cards here, James?
Yeah.
So I think since the teacher had asked me to kind of introduce the periodic table, this is where we're starting with periodicity. So my vision is I just took the first 18, so like main group elements, and I made cards out of them like this, James. So on one side, I put just the properties. So we're going to put a pin in this at the end. We're like, they have some initial models of what they think is going on. I'm not going to tell them it's magnesium. They're going to have some models that there must be something else in there. But then what I'm going to do, James, is give them a set of 18 of these cards, and we're just looking for patterns in these cards. So like, forget about the car. We'll come back to that later class. I want to give you some tools to kind of get there. And so they're going to put these cards in some kind of order. They're just looking for patterns. And then James, on the other side of the cards, I'm not going to let them flip them over, but then eventually when they find a pattern on the other side, I have an atomic charge model. So this is just basically the simplest way we could look at an atom, where you just have the protons and then valence electrons with some core electrons. So what I'm thinking then, James, is, all right, what patterns do we now see tied to the charges in the atoms? And then I think they maybe have enough background on, okay, they understand a little bit of this, like now I can introduce hydrogen is a part of this, oxygen's a part of this, magnesium's a part of this. So now let's go back to the cards and figure out what we think is going on, update their models, and then I can do the experiment. Yeah. So like on this standard on periodicity, James, what they have to do is use the periodic table as a model. So the actual practice that the kids have to do is they have to use the periodic as a model to explain a phenomena. That's what they're going to be doing with the cards. But it would be okay for us to then me getting out the magnesium ribbon and doing the whole like Bunsen burner thing. Are you with me on that?
Oh,
so
yeah,
like
absolutely.
then doing that, or let's compare it to zinc or something else. Like never let kids like free in the lab. Can I finish one thing on that, James?
Sure,
The way I would
absolutely.
normally do it is I would have the kids draw models of what they're thinking, and then they have to propose a investigation plan. You have to come up with a plan of how you're going to test this. It has to have control variables, and safety is going to be one of the most important things. And I don't let them have the equipment until they can show me their plan. Does that make sense, James? That is like a safe plan. Again, if I'm having a plan and investigation, I'm outside the scope of the standard. So they'll probably have to have a lot of help from me. I might have to help them in that, and that's okay, because it's really about them just using the periodic table as a model. Does that help?
Yeah, and just one quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
If they planned an investigation and they wanted to use something that you felt was a little too hazardous, would that be okay for you to be like, I will perform your experiment, or I'll make a video of doing this in a safe,
Absolutely.
controlled environment?
Totally agree. Yeah. It didn't matter that Alan saw me throw the blocks into the water. He just wanted to see the blocks in the water because he wants to test the
Very
model.
true.
So
Thank
who
you.
cares? Like there are certain skills they have to pick up. I want them to learn things like how to be precise and accurate in their measurements. I want them in the lab to learn those things, but it's mostly like, let's figure out if we're right or not. I want to figure out the answer. Really good question. Yeah.
Thanks, James. We're going to go ahead and go to Brian, and then Anya, we see your hand, but we're going to turn to some of the questions in the chat and come back to you. So just giving you a heads up there. Go ahead, Brian. You can unmute yourself. Brian Roekline.
Hey, Paul, how's it going?
Great.
So my question is, I'm in the process of teaching. I do modeling physics, and I'm transitioning to do the 3 dimensions. But I teach in a rural school in upstate New York, so I have a limited number of students in the class. Is there any method you have to get more diversity from a small amount of students?
Yeah, it's hard. How many, like, what are we talking about, Brian? Tell me like class size.
I have 5 this year.
Gotcha. No, that I think I had 4 in my first physics class. That's really, really hard. And you only have 1 physics class, is that right?
Yep, it's just the one.
Yeah. No, I think for me, it just is going to take longer. like you're going to get that time back because you can give them so much feedback on what they're doing. So like, I think the big thing is, did you see, Brian, when I threw up the phenomena and the chat was just dumped with like 80 questions, like really, really quick. So when I'm in classes where you have like 30 kids or 36 kids, it's really easy to get enough phenomena and model for me to choose. It just takes you a little bit more time, Brian, to get going with the phenomena. But then once we're there, like, I think there's like, I think it will accelerate just because there's fewer of us that we have to hear from. That's a really good question. I haven't been in that situation for a while. And so like, yeah, I'd love to see comments from the chat. I feel like, Brian, that's not a great answer, but I recognize the problem.
Keeping patient is fine, because it's just what I've been doing. And they're also 12th graders and haven't been modeling or doing 3 dimensions and, you know, since forever. So just being patient is what I'll keep doing.
Yeah. Also, I think I always try to divide each class like a pie chart too. And am I really trying to dedicate a third of my class to the content? Am I really trying to dedicate a third of my class to the practice? I'm sure for you, a lot of it's like mathematical modeling, Brian. But also, am I dedicating a third of my class to cause and effect and patterns and systems? And like those cross-cutting concepts are super important as well. So like using mini lessons on like what is a causal model or things like that, I think are also ways that you can fill up time and give them more things. Like generally, Brian, I'm kind of talking myself into a better answer. When kids are ever stuck with a phenomena, I usually bring in a new cross-cutting concept and say like, hey, we've been thinking about this for a while, but none of us have thought about it from the perspective of conservation of energy. So let's just look at it through the lens of conservation of energy. And that maybe can kickstart as well. That's the point of the cross-cutting concepts, is to just offer another lens to look at phenomena.
Yeah, and I guess with less kids, I do have more opportunity to do those mini lessons and have them sink in because there's less of them. So using those mini lessons on the concepts and the practices should help too.
Yeah, take a look at some of the ones I've done, especially around like, yeah, big system, like more complex system ones. I think I have like 6 system ones. I think you would like looking at kind of how I'm doing that.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so it looks like we only have time for 2 more questions. I promised Anya that she would get to ask a question, and then I wanted to get to some questions in the chat. So Paul, I'm going to let you decide. There are sort of 2 threads of questions in the chat. One is all around assessment. If you have any knowledge of what's in the pipeline in terms of New York State assessments, and then just, you know, thoughts about balancing test prep with NGSS design and phenomena-based teaching. So that's one thread of questions. Another thread of questions that a bunch of folks had were around engineering design and engineering practices, specifically for the life science, that folks are finding that maybe that's a little bit easier in the physical sciences. And do you have recommendations for engineering practices and engineering design in the life sciences?
So I get to choose. It's like this is a hard choice.
I know.
Let me just like, as we talk about the regents, if I just kind of answer the regents question really, really quickly, I don't know if that's what you're getting at or the state test. I felt like the way they adopted the standards, they did it a little too quickly. I can, from the people I've talked to, I think we're eventually going to see assessments that are really good 3-dimensional assessments on the state exams. Like I'm convinced that that will happen. It might not be right now, but it will be over the next few years. So like I would encourage you all to invest in all 3 dimensions because kids are going to be assessed on those. I think that's like you used to have the practices in the New York standards, but they were in a separate section on inquiry and people just ignored it. So like, I'm confident that that won't happen again. I'm trying to answer both questions, Uzma, sorry. The other one though, when it comes to environmental, I think we all have a limited view of engineering. My wife worked in the engineering department here at Montana State as an academic advisor. And she always told me I had to teach kids what engineering is at the beginning of the year. Engineering is not like CAD or designing something on a computer or inventing something. That's not what engineers do. Engineers use science and scientific concepts to solve a human problem. And a lot of us think of it through the lens of just like technology and gadgets. Environmental engineering is a huge growth area for kids to go into. And all we're looking at are what are impacts, human impacts in an area, and how can we reduce those? At our school at Bozeman High, we used to have a class on design, and they changed the name to engineering, and the number of girls taking the class just dropped to 0. And so it's really important how we message what this class is. Girls are way outnumbering boys in math and science, and university writ large, but not in computer science and engineering. So you might not be good at engineering, but you have to tell the kids every year, you could be a good engineer. Here are the 8 different types of engineering, and you could be a really good like industrial engineer or environmental engineer. So like kids have to hear that message over and over again that they could be an engineer. And they have to hear that from us because we're a required class that kids have to take. And it's not just an elective that they opt into. They have to hear it from their science teachers, like what engineering is. And 20% of your standards in New York are engineering standards. So if you're not teaching it, you're really not teaching 1/5 of the standards. Sorry, that was a soapbox. I try not to stand on a soapbox too much.
All right, thank you. With that, I think we can go to Anya. Anya, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. So my question is, I have the standards, they're posted in my room. I try to incorporate them, but I guess especially with last year's learning gap, not doing labs for so long and not really having even the kids wonder anything. How do you address teaching, like the cross-cutting concepts and the teaching practices? Because I find those being more difficult. I can spend a 40-minute class period on teaching a CER to almost then also miss the content that they were supposed to, I guess, get out of it.
Right. Yeah. So I think, Anya, what I would say is a mini lesson to teach a skill, it should never be separate from the inquiry that's going on in your class. It should be just needed. So like, if we're going to try to make an argument around like what caused that fire in that, or that explosion in the fire, and we really have to construct a good argument. So a mini lesson that's short, Anya, and it's like 5 or 10 minutes on what a claim, evidence, and reasoning should be, not about that science, but with a real simple example before they go in. And the way I would say it to your students, Anya, would be, we're going to write some arguments on this thing, but I want you to be ready to write those arguments. So let me do a mini lesson on a real simple, like a block or something like that. And now let's go apply it. I think that would be one way to answer your question, Anya. Don't let the cross-cutting concept and direct instruction of that become your class. It can't be that. The phenomena should sit at the center. But also, Anya, what I'm hearing from teachers coming back from lockdown and hybrid and all of that is that kids are just not, we want the motivation back. We want them excited about the learning. We want all of that back that has somehow been lost. And the best way to find it is like with an authentic phenomena that the kids care about. Like that is where we start. Like start with the phenomena and get them hooked again into just, Anya, like a quick thing you could try tomorrow in class, just like phenomena, give them a little bit of time to all write some questions down and then tell me what you think class is going on with the phenomena. Just giving them a little bit of time to observe, wonder, and then construct explanations. I always trust kids. Like they can do it. We just got to give them a space and a chance to do it. Also, I would never post like the standards in class. I would post just the practice. You know what I mean? A poster of let's get good at modeling. I think that's what you're probably trying to say.
Yeah, that's what I have. And I guess they get so stuck on the model that they almost lose it. They're like, I don't know how to do this. I'm like, it's just a drawing. Here's my house. Here's a model of my house. And I just draw a house on the board, but I'm trying to get them to just get used to the practice, I guess.
Yeah. Any way we can scaffold that at all. Like the worst thing for a kid is a blank piece of paper or a whiteboard that has nothing on it. So you scaffold a lot of that to get them started. So there's no bridge to kind of get them moving into it. That would be a piece of advice, Anya, I would say. Yep. You're doing the right way to teach science is have kids show what they're thinking on a whiteboard or something. That's the right way to teach science before you explain it. You're doing the right thing. But like Anya, it took us 40 years to figure out how to teach the content correctly. And we're in this renaissance now of how to teach the practices and cross-cutting concepts. So no, there's no, I don't hold myself up as like, I'm doing it perfect. We're all figuring out this along the way. And it's more important. Like their knowledge of mRNA viruses didn't get us out of this pandemic. Like it doesn't matter that they know about mRNA. It's can they look at a claim that somebody makes on TikTok and say, that's quite a claim. What evidence do you have and what reasoning do you have to back that up? Like we want kids who can literally stand up and say, what's your evidence and what's your reasoning? Like that's more important. Amen. Look at that. I even got an amen. Thank you.
Well, Paul, we have so many more questions, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to them all. I'd like to have one more question to go out on, and it's from Elma. She wrote it in the chat, and she wants to know, what advice do you have for teachers so that we can maintain and harness and continue to nurture our own sense of awe and wonder?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I almost struggle with this more than anyone. I just want to I want to understand so much about the natural world that my tendency is to go to Google too quickly or to look at a journal too quickly. So like for me, and I think like my wife and I travel together, and I think we're getting better at that, of just like, we see something, what do we wonder about it? What do we think is going on? Like the word that we keep saying to each other is, I've got a mental model of this is what I think is going on. How could we test the mental model? So I think like, don't answer by looking up the answer. I guess that would be the advice for us. Give a second to just do what I said. What am I curious about? What do I wonder about? And then how could I design an investigation that would test my wondering? I don't have to do it, but at that point, I've done enough of inquiry that for me to look up, did anybody do an experiment like this? I think that would be good. But I think we all struggle with that. I think we used to think our job was to explain science to kids, and it's not anymore. Like to teach them the skills so they can explain the science to themselves. That's our goal. And also, please surround yourself by people who believe the same thing as you. Don't be driven nuts by the teachers in your school who are pushing back on this, or you can't do inquiry, you can't. Those people will kill you. Like spend time around people who really are passionate and really care about the same things that you do. And so tonight was just a little bit of that with me. Thank you for being a part of that. It's fun to see some of the faces that I've seen before. And you've been that to me, of like, for me to see people fighting the fight and like learning and sharing it. So like, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, learning with you.